Men are good. Boys and Education. Part 1. Socializing the boy out of boys. This is a story that needs to be told. It's a sad tale about the feminist monster that's masqueraded as a gender equity movement. The reality is that the more the monster demanded for women and girls, the more boys and men suffered in one way or another. This isn't equity. This is selfishness and narcissism seeking unfair advantages. The reality is that feminists found that they could ask for anything and men would bend over backwards to give it to them. This is, of course, driven by gynocentrism, but that's another story. The usual ploy used by feminists was to tell only a part of the story. Like women are victims of domestic violence and men beat the crap out of these defenseless women. And the chant was, "Help us now to save these defenseless women." But wait a minute. Research has clearly shown us that it's actually correct about 25% of the time, but the feminists fail to tell the other 75% of the story, which is that a quarter of the time women are beating the crap out of men, and about 50% of the time it's simply a brawl between the two. So the feminist claim is that women are the sole victims and tied to the tracks. This sort of sob story pulls on the gynocentric levers of our gullible hero wannabe legislators, and the bullies get hundreds of millions of dollars just for them. Yes, now we have 2,000 shelters nationwide for female-only victims. That 25%, and to hell with the other victims. We just turn a blind eye to female violence. Yes, that's what feminism looks like. The arm we're going to look at in this series is the educational system. Feminists have been at this since the 1970s, voicing hysterical concerns for girls in schools, even though it was the boys who were disadvantaged. Our schools have evolved into being toxic places for boys, while being generally welcoming and friendly to girls. In later parts of this series, we'll tell the story of how feminists used half-truths to obtain hundreds of millions of taxpayer dollars, and we'll also go over the research that conclusively shows boys to be at the mercy of a feminine educational institution that punishes them for simply being male. But now let's look at what drives the feminist ideas about our schools. The problems start in the 1970s when radical feminists set their sights on the educational system. Guess what? They ran under the idea that we're all blank slates, that boys and girls are really the same except for some pesky reproductive differences and secondary sexual characteristics. In fact, the entire world to them is the same and is all based not on biology, but only on socialization. They believed that if only they could manipulate the socialization of the young, that they could erase sex roles entirely. Their dream was a world where sex roles didn't exist, and not only that, but gender itself no longer existed. We'd all be androgynous, all the same. This radical idea of the disappearance of gender is, of course, a variation on the Marxist idea of the classes disappearing in the New World Order. And that didn't work out so well, now did it? So how could these radicals best get things going? Well, two good places to start their socialization program right off the bat: home and school. And that's just where they started. The home has seen the demand for different roles from mom and the removal of fathers. Sex roles be damned. Of course, chaos follows. Hey, mothers can do anything fathers do, right? We're starting to find out just how wrong that is. And the schools? Well, just have a look at what these zealots initially did in the 1970s to textbooks. They made a short and effective drive to sanitize and propagandize all textbooks. Anything that might look like a sex role got the axe. To make women look like anything but a homemaker and men look like, insignificant wimps. Factual stories of strong men saving the day for women were erased. They were replaced with politically correct stories of women welders, women footballers, and of course superwomen saving the day as all looked on. Men were displayed as ineffectual and less significant. These changes to educational textbooks were accomplished in a very short period of time. By 1976, this mammoth task was completed. What do you think these changes did to young boys' perceptions of themselves? Feminists didn't care. They were on a mission to show girls they could do anything, and boys, they need to be controlled. This is just step one. So the feminists were on a mission to eliminate sex roles and believed that socializing boys and girls was the path to make that happen. Keep in mind that these folks literally believed that women and girls had been oppressed for eons, and indeed oppressed by selfish men. Not all were on board for this epic reworking of boys and masculinity, but the last 50 years has pretty much solidified their power. So the unspoken and unwritten strategy was to elevate the girls who had supposedly suffered for centuries and control and re-educate the boys who'd been the oppressors. There was even talk that the schools prior to feminist changes had been partly responsible to encourage boys in traditional roles, and it was high time to cease those mistakes. Now we'll get it right. We'll just eliminate traditional sex roles. To do this, they needed to restrict males and punish anything that looked like a show of chauvinistic strength. Exuberant boys became pathological and in need of punishment or medication. They were on a mission to change boys to become more, like girls. Be nice, sweet, and agreeable. They felt they had the power and the responsibility to keep boys from becoming chauvinists, and they were going to do all in their power to make that happen and whip them into shape. They knew they could be successful since it was their strong belief that all differences were socialized, and they, the schools, were responsible as the important socializers, right? But how does one decide what to reinforce in order to build this perfect, genderless society? What makes a wonderful adult? Yep. Someone who is wonderful is someone who looks and acts like feminists. Like women. Follow the rules, wait your turn, is polite, and on and on. Get the picture? This ain't the boys. And now if they have the assumption that boys and girls are blank slates and they're responsible to bring up the youth to adulthood, a part of that assumption is they need to make those obnoxious boys better. More like the girls. As hard as this is to believe, I think there's plenty of evidence to point in this direction. Women as a whole have been shown to score consistently higher on measures of agreeableness. That is, they tend to avoid conflict or disagreements, try to be nice and expect others to be like them, and do the same as they. So, are you getting the idea? Boys, unlike the girls, ain't going to score high on agreeableness. Not even close, while girls will be much more likely to do so. This leaves the teacher preferring the girls who are more agreeable, like herself, and she rewards them with preferential treatment and higher marks on their assignments, while at the same time making those naughty boys a project. Do change them into being more like agreeable girls. Won't the world be a better place if we all act like women? Don't laugh. This may sound ridiculous to you, but it's in the mind of many. I remember from my days being on the American Psychological Association's mailing list for the Society for the Study of Boys and Men. It was comprised of the top psychologists in the country, and one of the most influential men on the list wrote a message that literally said that men needed to catch up with women in their development. In other words, men were inferior, needed to be more like women. I kid you not. His message was met with a chorus of, "You go, girls." If the nation's top psychologists can think in those lines, just imagine what everyday teachers are thinking. Remember, if we're all blank slates, those rascal boys could easily be more like the girls if they would just be socialized enough to do so. The female teacher would see them as not following the program and intentionally opposing her, not because it's their nature, but because there's something wrong with them that needs to be socialized. We actually see something very similar in women in relationship, where they fail to see men's ways of processing emotions, but instead jump to the conclusion that there's something wrong with him since he's not doing it like she does. Ever see that? I've seen it over and over again. Same dynamic as the female teacher misunderstanding the boy's lack of agreeableness. It's sad and infuriating that men and boys are judged in these ways, and their actual biological inherent nature is misunderstood and shamed and expected to change rather than finding ways to accept them as they are. So boys live in a female world in schools that prefer girls in their nature and their defenses. They experience direct or indirect judgments about their sex, while females are held up as the banner for all to emulate. What is spoken in the classroom? Negative stuff about men. likely references to men having caused wars, men being domestically violent, men being greedy and ruining the economy, and on and on. All those hateful feminist ideas. If only women ruled the world kind of stuff, while women are portrayed as oppressed victims who need special treatment. It's their turn to have it all. You can't say a positive word about men or boys. You get the idea? What sort of environment is that for boys? It's easy to understand boys not wanting to grow up to be men, given this sort of toxic environment. They have very few models for the mature masculine, and lots of women telling them they need to change and be more like the girls. Who could learn under those circumstances where your sex is passively or actively portrayed as the problem? This is bullying. At one time, we thought that gays could become straight simply by getting the right socialization. We could send them to therapy to make them straight. We've come to understand that sexual orientation is impacted by biology and other factors. We're learning to love gays for who they are and accept them as they are. We see a very similar dynamic with feminists wanting to change boys through socialization. Here's a clue for feminists. They were born that way. Can you love them for their differences and accept them as they are? So far, the answer from feminists is no. Next up will be the Gender Equity Act of 1994 and the feminist lies that netted them $360 million to build an educational empire and ensure that all voices in the educational system were feminist voices. And let's not forget, men and boys are good, as are you. Like, subscribe, comment, all that stuff. Please come see me on Patreon. We could use the support. You take care.